When we started to talk to those closest to him, his family members, ex-wives, we realized that this man appeared to be a monster and no one knew it. And they all had one common denominator. They were deathly afraid of Russell Vane.
In 2020, we interviewed Sally Wolter, the detective who captured one of America's most brutal killers, Russell Vane.
He would sexually assault children. He would lock them in closets and burn them with cigarettes. He would rape their mothers while they sat in the closet watching. It was pure evil, like I've never seen before.
Hi, I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut. For 3 decades, the murders of Kathy Darling and Diane Holloway were shrouded in mystery, until the cases landed on the desk of Sally Wolter.
I couldn't imagine over a 30-year period how so many women, children, could have been violated and no one knew about it. Russell Vane is the type of person that your parents warn you to watch out for. I mean, he's pure evil. Grand Rapids, it's usually been a safe place to live, and it's a good place to raise your family. But there are some dangerous places in Grand Rapids. And in particular, some of these homicides that we investigated are in the heart of some of the most impoverished places that we have in Grand Rapids. Kathy Darling was a 17-year-old mom of a 14-month-old who was pregnant with her second child. She lived alone at her upstairs apartment on Michigan Avenue in Grand Rapids. Her husband was incarcerated in Michigan prison, but in 1976, there were a series of murders of young women in their home and on the city streets, and I'm certain that Kathy Darling was frightened of that. She was a lonely young lady, and she had a male friend that she began seeing. Kathy Darling's mother-in-law found out, and she was not happy, nor was any of the Darling family. They tried to catch her boyfriend at Kathy Darling's home on several occasions. On March 19th, 1976, the Grand Rapids Police Department is called to Kathy Darling's home. So when the police arrived, they found her naked on the bed. She had been strangled, beaten, and sodomized. And inside the home was her 14-month-old child in the next room. They ended up talking to her boyfriend, and it was explained to them that there was an altercation the evening before, and that he was spending the night with Kathy when in the middle of the night, somebody pulled up and began pounding on the door. He was in bed with Kathy, and he immediately got up and hid in the closet in her bedroom, and Kathy went to the door to answer it. When she got there, there were several individuals that wanted to come in, and one of them was her brother-in-law, brother to her husband. He came with 3 other men and a female. Her boyfriend heard them looking for him inside the home. There was a physical altercation, and he saw an opportunity to run out the door, and he ran into Westra's restaurant asking them to call the police.
A murder investigation was launched, but detectives were left frustrated by the evidence before them.
When we spoke with her brother-in-law, he admitted that he was working at a gas station with Russell Vane that evening, and he was going to try and catch her boyfriend. He said that they were going to beat him up, that was their intentions. After they left Westra's restaurant, they picked up some alcohol and went back to a friend's house. Her brother-in-law felt sick later that morning and decided to walk home. Russell Vane left with his stepsister. He took her home, and he went to his ex-wife's home and spent the night there. The individuals who were at that apartment to last see Kathy alive agreed to take a polygraph, and everyone passed. Everybody had an alibi, and there was no person that stuck out that would have had a motive to want to harm Kathy Darling.
With seemingly no leads, the case came to a standstill.
Had they found out about Russell Vane, that might have piqued their interest a little bit more. Russell Vane is the type of person that your parents warn you about to watch out for. I mean, he's pure evil, but those detectives never knew that he was anything more than what the rest of them were, and that was just alcoholics. And they live in impoverished area that they did what everybody else did. They just worked and then went and got drunk at night. And they didn't know that that was a monster in hiding.
3 years later, the killer re-emerged and struck again.
Diane Holloway worked for the U.S. Postal Service and had a boyfriend by the name of John who lived at 10 Lexington in Grand Rapids. Diane was a hard-working 21-year-old who lived with her parents. The only problem with Diane was she had a bad choice for a boyfriend. And her parents were trying to get her to walk away from her boyfriend. John was an alcoholic, was abusive, and her parents didn't want Diane around that. Diane also stressed some unhappiness with John to her coworkers in that he had been abusive to her. Diane was working and got off about 12:30 in the morning on the 25th of August, 1979. Her coworker drove her to John's apartment. According to Diane's girlfriend, her intentions were to break up with him and then take a cab home. And that was the last that her coworker saw of her. When Arlene found her daughter had not returned home in the middle of the night, she then got in her car and drove over to John's apartment to find her daughter, thinking maybe she just overslept. And no one was home. She hadn't called her mother either. And so her mother went in panic mode, looking for her, looking for John. The next day, Arlene showed up to John's apartment, and when she found nobody there, she started looking around, and the first thing she saw was a pair of her daughter's underwear laying outside the porch. She also found her daughter's necklace, which was broken and laying on the ground in front of the apartment. So she immediately got on the phone and called the police and told them they better come there because her daughter's missing.
Cops worked around the clock to find answers to the mysterious disappearance of Kathy.
When she ended up finding John, John said, "I haven't seen her. I thought she went home." She had been gone a full day now, and John seemed not to have a care in the world that his girlfriend was gone, other than he didn't have any idea where she went. The police saw red marks on the wall, which appeared to be like blood splatter. They found a brick out front that had red marks on it, appearing to be blood. They ended up bringing in a crime scene team and searching that entire residence, but there was no signs of a struggle. John explained that he was at home at 12:30 that evening when Diane got off work and came to his home. At that time, he had guests at his house. According to John, they initially had steaks for dinner, and they'd been drinking. And when Diane arrived there after work, she was alone, and she was happy. There was no issues. She drank with them. And John said he decided to go to bed because he had to work in the morning, leaving Russ Vane and Diane alone. John said that he awoke the next morning because his boss was pounding on the door because he failed to show up for work. And when John got up out of bed, he found Russell Vane sleeping on the floor. And he kicked Russell and said, "Where's my girlfriend?" And he said he didn't know that she had left and gone home. So John didn't realize that Diane was missing until he was confronted by Arlene Holloway the following day. The neighbor next door heard an argument that had occurred early in the morning between John and Diane Holloway, and that they were screaming outside the front porch. John is questioned, and he said, "Absolutely did not happen. We had no argument. There was no reason for us to argue. She was happy." So the police continued to talk to anybody else who was in that apartment. Russell Vane said that he was the last person to see Diane alive, that they were talking out on the porch about her troubles with John, and at some point he decided just to go in and lay down on the floor, and she left to go get a cab, and that was the last time he had seen her. And so they focused on John because if anybody had a motive, if Diane did come there to break up with him, he'd be the most likely person to want her some harm to come to her. His story started to change. At the first initial interview with them, he claims that they had steaks for dinner. Second claim is they had pizza, and that Diane had pizza with them. So John didn't do himself any favors by his behavior. He also didn't shed a tear, didn't seem to want to go out and search for Diane. The only person that was leading that search was Diane's mother, Arlene. It seemed as though John had just taken a step back, and this really drew the attention of those investigators to that. Diane is reported missing. On Monday, the police come back to that residence, and they're searching high and low for Diane. And they elicit the help of some city workers that are nearby. But a half hour later, and they come running back to the apartment and said, "We think we found her." Diane had been murdered, raped, strangled, and her body was discarded not too far from John's apartment by the railroad tracks and the train depot. Her body was placed and covered by pallets, boards, insulation. Her purse is found by a riverbank about half a block away from John's apartment. Her blouse, her corduroy jacket, her blue jeans, and her brown shoes were found at that same location. There were obvious signs of blood on all her clothing, her pants, her underwear. When they separated the clothes, they realized that there was a cord wrapped inside the arm of the blue corduroy jacket, which was indicative of the same ligature mark that came across Diane's neck.
With no obvious leads or evidence, the investigation hit a dead end.
The detectives ran out of the ability to prove who was responsible. They certainly gave it their best effort in focusing on John. They offered polygraphs to everybody, and they all passed those polygraphs. Even though John would have been eliminated by a polygraph, the police were not comfortable with his behavior and his actions and his uncooperativeness at some point in that investigation. He refused to take a polygraph initially, hired an attorney who said that he was having a mental breakdown and that they were no longer allowed to talk to him. That's not a willing, cooperative boyfriend. John felt the focus was solely on him and so intensified that he left the state of Michigan and found residence in Missouri.
It wasn't until the cold case team began looking over the investigation files 30 years later that some links began to emerge.
There was approximately 180 unsolved murders back in 2006 when this team was formed. So when you open some of these cases, you might have some gals who are prostitutes or are in situations in which they place themselves in unfavorable spots where they become a victim. And Diane Holloway was not that, nor was Kathy Darling. These are two women that were so brutally murdered and discarded like trash.
The twisted story of Russell Vane is just one of the many incredible cases we have in our vault here at True Crime Uncut. Remember to let us know which killer you'd like us to cover next in the comments, and please do click the thumbs up button down below. Now back to Sally Wolter and this extraordinary investigation.
The good thing about cold cases now is that once you start plugging in all this detailed information, it's very clear to see the association between some of these cases. And we notice how unlucky is it for one man to see two women alive just before their death? Is that unlucky, or is that not a coincidence? Well, when we made the connection that Russell Vane was actually one of the last people to see them both alive, he's somebody we really want to talk to. But before we talk to him, we want to know who he is. And the beauty of our team is there is no rush for us. And we did a full-blown investigation into Russell Vane.
A development in the case revealed a disturbing backlog of unreported crimes.
We start looking into Russell Vane, of who he is and what he did for a living, where he lived. We did a timeline. We also have to eliminate anybody else in these reports that may have been overlooked, just so that we don't put the blinders on. We couldn't get Russell Vane out of focus. We realized that he was an alcoholic, that he had some violent tendencies. When we started to talk to those closest to him, we realized that this man appeared to be a monster, and no one knew it. We looked at his criminal history, and he had break-in. He had one assault case, and that was unrelated to anything that would have drawn us to him being responsible for such heinous crimes here. It was contacting family members who started to disclose, more or less like peeling through an onion, of all the layers of just pure evil that this man was. I am certain that if the original detectives had an ounce of what some of these women had told us, their focus would have shifted from John to Russell Vane. The women would tell us that Russell Vane had a penchant for violence for women and children. All his friends, his associates, it took us 2 years, but we interviewed every single friend and every single woman that was related to those friends. And slowly, one by one, each one described horror with Russell Vane from ages 4 to 30. And I couldn't imagine over a 30-year period how so many women, children, could have been violated and no one knew about it. And they all had one common denominator. They were deathly afraid of Russell Vane.
Police heard harrowing testimony from so many women that there was little doubt that they had a sexual predator on their hands.
I think the one that bothered me the most was the story from the family friend, but she was raped by him at the age of 15. She had gotten into a vehicle with him, and he took her on a desolate road and raped her, and she became pregnant with his child. And her family was angry about that. She tried to explain to her family that she was raped, and they didn't believe her. She ended up staying with Russell as girlfriend after the birth of their child, and then she became pregnant with a second child. But the fights were so intense between those two, and the beatings, and the sexual assaults that occurred, that you couldn't imagine living through one of them. But she had years of pure physical abuse in which she was sodomized so many times, and yet never told a soul. It was heartbreaking, because for the first time in a lot of these women's lives, they were telling a secret that had weighed on their shoulders forever. But it wasn't easy to tell the story, because their first questions, all of them, were, where is he? And is he going to come and get me now? They were children when all these assaults happened, and they're women now, and they're still fearful of him. And so we realize that he must hold something over them, and it was the beatings. If Russell Vane said he was going to kill you, well, once they found the body of Kathy Darling and they found the body of Diane Holloway, their fears came true. And they realized he's somebody to watch out for, because they all knew in their minds he's responsible for those homicides. He would sexually assault children. He would lock them in closets and burn them with cigarettes. He would rape their mothers while they sat in the closet watching. It was pure evil like I'd never seen before. There was one woman that went to the police because she wanted to report her 4-year-old daughter had been raped by Russell Vane. And it was basically a he said, she said situation. There was no physical evidence that the police could prove, and Russell Vane denied it. If anybody who was sexually assaulted knew that that was reported to the police and nothing happened, there is no incentive to go tell them your story. It's just best to take the beating, be raped, and accept it. If it's not reported to the police, then they'd have no idea. And when we knocked on their door and sat down and told them that we know about these sexual assaults that occurred and many women are coming forward, and if they'd been a victim, now's the time, because we're going to make sure that that fear goes away forever. And they were willing to talk. But it's like peeling the scab of a wound that you've tried to hide for so long. And a lot of their families had no idea. They knew they were going to have to go to court. And all of them agreed to do so. That spoke volumes.
crime scene evidence was sent back to the lab in the hope advances in forensic science would now provide some answers.
When we searched Diane's clothing, we were looking for anything that could put Russell Vane or anybody else in connection as a suspect. There was a washcloth that was found in John's apartment, and it had some brown spots on it, and we sent that in to be tested. It appeared that it may have been blood, but John explained that away by saying when we had steak that evening, we wiped up the blood off the counters. That's pretty logical that that could be, but I wanted to make sure that that was not human blood then. The crime lab determined that there were some profiles that were human. One was Diane Holloway, and the other two were males. Why would their blood be on this washcloth with Diane's? So the two most likely people, John and Russ Vane. So we traveled to Missouri and Alabama to get their DNA. We made contact with Russell Vane at his residence. He was a very frail-looking man. Maybe years of substance abuse, of alcohol and drugs had caught up with him. You would think that one would say, "Why do you want to talk to me? I've already spoke to the police." He had no questions like that. He was just willing to come with us and provided a DNA profile for us. He confessed that he was the last person to see Diane Holloway and Kathy Darling. He admitted that he was there at both scenes, and probably how unlucky for him. He also tried to downplay his behavior back in those days by saying, "I was really bad back then, so bad that I can't even remember some of the things I did because of alcohol." Another thing he said, when talked about violence to some of these women, and he said, "The most violent things I've done, I can't remember." That made me think that he did remember everything he did to those women, because he emphasized violence, and so did they. So it had to be true. What a coward, because he preyed on young, weak women and children, and how sad, because he destroyed every single one of their lives. And it appeared that it didn't affect him. I was disgusted, but I had to put on a strong face and not show my emotion. That's a difficult thing for us as investigators. We can sit there and be talking to the most evil man in front of you, and you have to act like you're okay with it. He showed no remorse, other than the fact that he acknowledged that he was violent back then, and of all the bad things he did, it was when he was drinking. And so that was his excuse. I knew that he was a monster, but when you look at him with the photos back in 1976, and then in 2008, he looked like two totally different men. In 1976, the man that everybody was fearful of looked like Paul Bunyan, a big, hefty, heavy-set guy that was an alcoholic and a bully. This man, who's 58 years old, is a frail, old, gray-haired man that you couldn't possibly think that that is the man responsible. But they all described the same man back in 1976 and 79.
After an excruciating wait, the forensics came back.
The DNA profiles obtained from John and Vane could not be excluded as the people who deposited that DNA. You would expect John's DNA to be on that wash rag. It's his apartment. He probably handled it. Why would Russell Vane have blood on that washcloth unless he cleaned up after the murder of Diane Holloway? To us, that was a smoking gun.
Without a definitive DNA match, there wasn't enough to arrest Vane for murder, but they could charge him with sexual assault.
After 2 years of talking to all these victims, we were going to write an arrest warrant for Russell Vane for 5 of those rapes that we uncovered. We flew to Cullman, Alabama, and arrested Russell Vane for those sexual assaults.
During a pre-trial hearing, Vane's ex-partner Claudia took to the stand, and the prosecution had an unexpected breakthrough.
We decided to use that preliminary hearing almost like a full-blown trial. It lasted over 5 days because we wanted to secure testimony for people who may be not well physically or may leave town and not want to testify again. So we did it as a trial in hopes that also that we would show Russell Vane enough of our cards to say, don't put these victims through anything more. We had been diligently trying to identify where this rope came from. The rope was found with Diane Holloway's clothing at the preliminary hearing. And our prosecutor holds up that rope and shows it to Claudia just in an attempt to see if it would trigger any, memory. Claudia got up and ran out of the courtroom and threw up and passed out in the hallway. I ran out to try to find Claudia, and she was in a panic. And she explained that that rope was hers, that she worked at a factory where they would stack tires with these binders of ropes that have metal grommets spaced sporadically through them. And she said at the time she was pregnant. She didn't have maternity clothes, and so she had to wear pants with the zipper and the button undone, and her pants would fall down. So one day, she decided to cut that rope and use it as a belt. So she had approximately 12 to 15 of these individual size ropes throughout her car and throughout their house to hold her pants up. And it wasn't until the preliminary hearing that she recalled where that was from. If that was the rope that was used to strangle Diane Holloway, Russell Vane took that from their home or their car. 5 victims got up to testify against Russell Vane. They were so brave. Those are heroes in my book. I think that was enough for him and his attorney to say, do we want to go through 2 full-blown trials to repeat this process? And I think they did the wise thing. They chose to plea.
Vane pleaded guilty to the murders of Kathy Darling and Diane Holloway in exchange for dropping the sexual assault charges.
When the judge asked if he was responsible for the death of Kathy Darling and Diane Holloway, he said yes. That was good enough for me. We asked the assault victims if they were okay with that, and they all were, because they knew that Vane would never have received the penalty that he had. They have consolation knowing that Russell Vane will never see the outside of a prison.
As Vane had to be punished under the rules of the time, his sentence was crafted to ensure he remained in jail for life.
According to the term limits of that era, life in prison did not mean life in prison. It could mean any time up to a series of 15 years. So the judge did some creative sentencing here to ensure that Russell Vane will never be released. And he sentenced Russell Vane to life in prison for the murder of Diane Holloway and 35 to 90 years for Kathy Darling, which means that he will have to serve a minimum of 35 years before he could be released. That's a life sentence for Russell Vane, and that will ensure that he'll never get out of prison. Russell Vane had no reaction whatsoever during the preliminary examination or at sentencing. He maintained the same expression throughout, like he was bored with the whole process. The families of Diane Holloway and Kathy Darling were able to see that justice was finally served for their kids and their siblings. The sexual assault victims were there, and it was truly a day of reckoning for them. You come to know these families because you're working for them for over 4 years, and so you have an emotional tie to them. And so it was good to be able to hug them and let them know that we were there for them and their loved one, and that we hadn't forgotten. And that meant the world to them, that we found that monster that was friends with all of them. I remember talking to Diane's mother, Arlene Holloway, and she said she would forgive Russell for what he did, but she will never forget.
Justice had finally been done.
The efforts that we had put into this, very emotional and draining for us as well. But the things that I'll most remember is the day that we arrest Russell Vane for those homicides. I'll never forget that, because that was true evil that had been removed from the streets, and we're responsible for that. And there's a lot of pride in that, for sure. I think the shocking element of this whole case is that here we are trying to solve 2 murders, and we find that they're connected by one person, and then uncovering 20 additional sexual assaults that went unreported throughout this whole era. I think that was the most troubling. I'm satisfied with the end result, knowing that he'll never walk outside those prison gates again, and that the general public is safe. I think that Russell Vane is pure evil, has been from early childhood. Ever since he was 12 years old, he had some sexual tendencies that he couldn't control. He had been taken by his family to psychiatric evaluation. So he had this demon on his back, I believe, since he was a young child. All the makings for a pedophile. I think he's the monster that hides in the dark. He preys upon young women and children and the weak. And I think prison is the best place for him.
At the time of recording this video, Russell Vane is incarcerated at the Chippewa Correctional Facility in Michigan. He will never be released. We hope you enjoyed this video on the horrifying crimes of Russell Vane. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video, as it really helps the channel. I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.